Good morning to you all, and thank you for braving the heat and getting here. Though right now I feel like one should be braving the cold in this room. But that's, I think, a problem in many places, at least in India and to some extent abroad, that we overcompensate for whatever is the energy correction that we're trying to do. Well, as you know, this session is on infrastructure financing, and so forth. We have three very distinguished experts in this area. I believe biodata have been circulated to everybody in the package, so I don't need to take time going over those. The only substantive comment, not substantive, but interesting comment I'll make is that we are changing the order of the speakers on the panel by mutual consent. We're going to begin with Professor Nishizawa, who is going to give his perspective from a Japanese international side on some of these issues of this session. He will be followed by Mr. Kumar Pratap, who is the Joint Secretary in Finance Ministry responsible for infrastructure, and in particular infrastructure financing, PPPs and so forth. And then of course we will have Mrs. Kuller, who used to be the CEO of Niti Aayog, and before that Secretary Planning Commission in its previous avatar, and has had a lot of experience in this area too. So I will not take up valuable time by talking on a subject on which I know very little. I will turn straight away, if I may, to invite Professor Nishizawa to begin. I believe the rules of the game which have been circulated are each panelist should speak for not more than 20 minutes, and then we shall open it up.
Just let me thank ICRIER, especially Raja, for giving me this wonderful opportunity to joining the great speakers and audience. I'm so glad and honored to joining you this morning. My presentation is about, shown here, what quality infrastructure is worth financing. Quality infrastructure financing, or quality infrastructure investment, is one of the concepts developed by Japanese government, especially in the context of G20. As Japanese government serving as a president of this forum, they've been promoting this concept and sharing with members how they feel this concept worth considering. So I'm going to talk about quality infrastructure, but I have three, following Dr. Chayu's suggestion, I split into three, this my part. Which one? This one? Shall I move to the podium? Oh, okay. It's working. So I'm going to talk about two successful examples of transport infrastructure. And then move on to the next part, the common challenges now and going forward. And then the last part is what quality infrastructure should we finance? This is one of the successful examples. This is my assessment, Delhi Metro. And Japan worked with Indian counterparts to make this metro a quite successful project. And I understand there are many following projects in all over India. But not only India, but in other part of the world, the experience of Delhi Metro is now shared. But I'm not the right person to talk about the Delhi Metro itself. So I'm going to talk about another successful example in Japan. So this is not necessarily infrastructure. This wonderful yellow leaves. This is ginkgo trees in the autumn season in Tokyo. This is a very famous place in Tokyo, town called Nenchofu, which has a long history. Oh. No. It's okay. It's long history. In the early 1990s, H. Shibusawa, very famous person, widely known today as the father of Japanese capitalism. And this person is going to show up. His portrait will be used for the banknote, 10,000 yen banknote, which will be introduced in 2020. So this is a historical figure. But he developed a residential town by emulating the garden suburbs that were growing in metropolitan areas around the world during that period, particularly those in Greater London. He did that by creating a company called Garden City Company. This is his photo, and this is, sorry, this is compressed somewhat, but this is an image of this garden city. This gentleman, H. Shibusawa's Garden City Company, gave birth to a business model to develop railways in tandem with new residential neighborhoods, so-called integrated approach, underlining the origin of Tokyu Corporation, a private railway company in the greater Tokyo area. I'm not from Tokyu Corporation, but the reason why I know this story is, of course, widely known in Japan, but also I live along the lines run by this railway company. So I'm a beneficiary, one of the beneficiaries of this great achievement of Mr. H. Shibusawa more than 100 years ago. Tokyu Corporation has focused on railway operations in suburban Tokyo, but also real estate and life service businesses in areas served by Tokyo lines, several railways, including a hotel and resort and business support businesses. They expand their businesses in several different areas, but all these are integrated. So this is the map of the lines. It is not as big as the Delhi Metro nowadays, but quite extensive. And all these are connected with Japan Railways, East, and other railway companies' lines. So this is network. Connectivity worked. This is one of the area in Tokyo near Tama River called Futago Tamaga, recently developed. There are some residential areas together with a commercial area. One of the buildings there are bigger one is headquarters of Rakuten Company. And stations are located nearby with shopping malls. Well, this is a station in a place called Nenchofu. This is the kind of origin of this company. And very quiet residential area. This is supermarket located nearby that station. So Tokyu Corporation developed railways and also residential area, commercial areas, And now they provide services to elderlies as well, because Japan is aging. A lot of old people have difficulty going to buy something nearby shops, so they provide services to help them purchase daily necessities, for example. So this Tokyo group, Tokyo company, Tokyo corporations embeds positive externalities by building complementary business clusters throughout its railway networks. This is a kind of business model, very unique to Tokyo Corporation. But this is not original. There's another company, private company in Kansai area near Osaka, the Hankyu Railway Company. They did the same, they introduced the same model more than 100 years ago. So these two companies' models are quite effective to running their railway businesses, but also city development, urban development. So what we could learn from this company's achievement should be what is the important things is how to maximize positive externalities. Building railways, a lot of business, commercial activities start along the lines. Jobs are created, and government could get tax revenues from activities. All these positive externalities. Minimize negative externalities by providing public transportation services. Less congestion, less pollution. These are example negative externalities, but public transportation services help minimize such negative externalities. Enable conditions. I'm sure this is a very good model, but cannot be introduced without enabling environment conditions. Fortunately for this company, land acquisition was not a big issue. I know in India, land acquisition is a very, very difficult issue. Yeah. But fortunately for this company, in Japan, land acquisition was not the serious constraint. And there was demand during the major Taisho Showa, although there was a war, so there was some disruption, but still there's always growing demand in suburban Tokyo for residential, for housing, public transportation, and other services for people's daily life. Nowadays, Tokyo Corporation focus is elderly. So that is for them another opportunity to expand their business. Elderly houses, services provided, and health services, all these are provided by this company. I'm sure I'm going to be the beneficiary of such services within 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And connectivity. As I mentioned earlier, this private railways are connected to other railways run by Japan Railway and other private railway companies or Tokyo Metro. Without changing trains, we can move from one line to the other, most of the cases. So this network connectivity is quite beneficial for their businesses, but also for us users. So this is two successful examples, although I didn't talk much about Delhi Metro because you know much more than I know about Delhi Metro. So second part is common challenges now and going forward. I use this image in my class all the time. I like this one from Economist magazine, that mind the funding gap. These gentlemen want to connect this uncompleted bridge, but because of funding gap, they cannot complete construction. So always, funding gap is an issue. These are numbers often quoted. ADB's meeting age as infrastructure needs, a bit older, 2017. Often mentioned figure is 1.7 trillion per year of demand for infrastructure in 45 developing member countries of ADB. And, well, narrowing down slightly, for 25 developing member countries for the period from 2016 and 2020, investment, comparing the needs, which is shown in the middle, 1.3 trillion per year, actual investment in 2015 was $881 billion. So the gap is shown there, 2.4% of GDP. Always, policymakers are discussing how to fill this gap. So this is obvious. Estimated infrastructure investment needs cannot be materialized without finance. Finance is crucial. But I'm asking this by myself all the time. Is it sensible policy to bridge the entire infrastructure financing gap? Not many people say this. A lot of people, majority of people, or all the people say, well, we have to fill this gap. We have to introduce PPPs to mobilize private fund. We have to increase tax revenues to fill this gap. But I have a slightly different opinion. Of course, we have to fill the gap. But to what extent? This is another image I often use in my class. My question always is, what story can you tell from this image? Yeah, pouring water excessively, what's going to happen? Well, this is my answer to the question. Debt fuel infrastructure investment may lead to a classic diminishing returns problem. Poorly designed projects may not generate returns. Sometimes negative returns might coming out. So we should carefully plan ahead the projects and only finance bankable projects or the good project which could be justified for social reasons or some policy reasons. Yesterday, I enjoyed sessions on aging. I was I enjoyed it. It's really exciting moment for me. But aging is not only people. Infrastructure is also aging. In Japan, many highways, tunnels, bridges were built 40 years ago, 50 years ago. So they are aging. We need to take care of them. But we need fund to fix holes, maintain the quality of services provided by old infrastructure. Or otherwise, we would have a big trouble. That accidents, the bridge might fall down, or tunnels, very, very dangerous. Another thing, that the act of God, natural calamities, we need to have a very resilient infrastructure, especially in Japan. We have a lot of earthquakes. Fortunately, we had devastating tsunami. Or nowadays, we have a typhoon, unusually strong wind and rains hit our country. So infrastructure should be well designed. We need to make infrastructure resilient to such unfortunate incidents. But this is act of God. We have to get prepared. This is a kind of conceptual framework I often use. This is kind of balance sheet of a country as a whole. On asset side, there are a lot of uncertainties, and diminishing returns are unavoidable, or depending on how much we invest and accumulate assets. Oh, this is not the country, this is kind of government, the public sector balance sheet. So I put the power to tax. Liability side are borrowing. And borrowing costs are predetermined. You have to pay the cost. If you borrow, you have to pay interest, pay principal on time in full. But liability side, there are a lot of risks, foreign exchange risks, if you borrow from overseas in foreign currencies. If government provide guarantee, there's a possibility of call of guarantee that add to the existing government debt, so-called contingent liabilities. There are many, many uncertainties. It is often the downside risks. Or upside, how could I say? The liability tend to become bigger and bigger because of these uncertainty risks. Asset side, to keep anticipated returns are challenging. And the government cannot just increase tax revenues or increase tax rate. It's politically very challenging. So borrowing or providing some kind of support, guarantee or some other means for investment need to be very carefully done. Potentially, this could happen if we mismanage the current investment. So we have to be careful. Yes, it's very important to fill the gap because there's a need for infrastructure services, good infrastructure services, high quality infrastructure services. But supply are not enough. So we have to invest in infrastructure. We need fund. There's no free lunch. But we have to mobilize fund carefully. Especially when you borrow, you have to borrow carefully. And project selection should be carefully done. The last part, what quality infrastructure should we finance? This is, I just copied G7 Ise-Shima principles for promoting quality infrastructure investment. These principles show some key concept: life cycle cost, and addressing social environment impacts, and so on and so forth. And they have principle 5 referring to PPP. PPP is very tricky animal. Not magic, it's not the panacea. But I'll skip this slide. The next one is T20 Summit, from T20 Summit communique. This communique was delivered just a few days ago in Tokyo. I highlighted some of the key concepts. Well, there is an urgent need for G20 countries to develop high-quality infrastructure that is cost-efficient over the life cycle and maximize their contribution to economic growth. The Sustainable Development Goals and the environmental outcome, including impact on and resilience to climate. High-quality infrastructure should encompass all benefits and costs, including spillover effects and externalities. I like this part especially, because you've seen that I think it's very important how we could maximize externalities with equal consideration to economic, social, and environmental dimensions. The positive spillover effects of infrastructure, if well managed, can boost GDP and tax revenues. This is in line with what I mentioned at the municipal, regional, national levels, and in turn be utilized to address the gap between infrastructure demand and availability of finance. I think this last part is something to do with what Rajat mentioned yesterday, that you connect the quality infrastructure and the finance flows. So these are key messages from T20 Summit Task Force 4, working on infrastructure. This is the last slide, kind of conclusion. With quality infrastructure, users enjoy services, while all the beneficiaries and taxpayers are convinced to pay the cost. So this is poor service provision. The below is better services provision. People are unhappy, people are happy. So quality infrastructure offers quality of life. Sometimes when Japanese government officials or say the quality infrastructure, it is seen as, oh, very expensive one. No, quality infrastructure concept is something to offer quality of life. And in that context, the quality infrastructure need to design to better serve people in a particular country or region. So we cannot just export Japan model to India, for example. That is very important when we, especially Japanese side, people on Japanese side talk about quality infrastructure. There's some misunderstanding. So this is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Nishizawa, for giving us a very nice overview, sometimes zeroing in on a particular, like in the first part of your exercise project in the Garden City in Tokyo. I must say I was also very impressed by your deployment, very effective deployment of cartoons. And I think perhaps Rajat might want to take on board the suggestion, the idea that at the next round of the G20 conference, you require that all papers should consist only of, be made up of cartoons. In the sense of every idea should be conveyed through cartoons. I think that would make for both a very entertaining as well as, when one is entertained, one is also very absorbed. So effective communication. At least that's my idea. Otherwise, I might write a textbook with cartoons. Well, without further ado, let me turn to Mr. Pratap to get us into the nitty-gritty of our infrastructure problems in India, some of the experiences we've had and some successes as well as failures.
Thank you, and good afternoon. I'd like to start with where Professor talked about the G20 infrastructure principles. These would be taken up in early June. The Finance Minister of India would be represented in that meeting. These are the proposed principles of the Japanese presidency. The objective is, of course, maximizing the positive economic, environmental, social, and developmental impact of infrastructure and create a virtuous circle of economic activities. We already saw that Japan has prioritized 6 quality infrastructure investment principles: sustainable growth and development, added on the insistence of China. As the base, we thought it was obvious, but then they insisted. Promoting economic efficiency in view of life cycle costs. And we strongly supported this, India strongly supported this, basically because it mainstreamed operation and maintenance expenses. The general tendency is to emphasize new construction as opposed to maintaining existing infrastructure. It's a less costly way of achieving the same objectives. Integrating environmental considerations in infrastructure investments. Again, there was talk of low carbon emission trajectory. India in that meeting said that there cannot be absolute low carbon, while we have one of the biggest renewable energy programs in the world. India would implement about 175 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2022. But then there's this well-known theorem in economics called Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, which emphasizes that the competitive advantage of nations needs to be built on their abundant resources. India being a coal-rich country, the trajectory would have to be tempered by the reality of having an abundant resource, which needs to be utilized. Building resilience against natural disasters and social considerations, we strongly supported that. There was one point that we made in that meeting, which was about open access to infrastructure. Now, there was talk of absolute open access to everybody. Now, if you want good infrastructure, it needs to be paid for. So open access in that sense would be compromised, and that was accepted by the presidency. Strengthening infrastructure governance. And there was some discussion on macroeconomic debt sustainability, how infrastructure needs to be built so that it ensures that. India interjected in this, saying that this should be related to public sector infrastructure financing, rather than trying to link it with private sector infrastructure financing also. We made the point that most private sector infrastructure financing is based on project finance model, where the revenue streams of the projects themselves provide the confidence to the lenders. So the balance sheet of nations, which is what macroeconomic debt sustainability relates to, need not be related to private sector financing of infrastructure. That was accepted by the Japanese presidency. One of the principles, one of the points in the document that we're still discussing is about the voluntary and non-binding nature of these principles. This is right in the preamble of the document. India has made a point that this should be voluntary and non-binding for every country, which is every G20 country, but also for the multilateral development institutions. Now, based on the consensus, G20 consensus, the MDBs can go around putting them as additional conditionalities for financing to developing countries. So in that sense, it becomes non-voluntary and binding. And we are still under discussion with the Japanese presidency on this. I'd like to illustrate, we are completely on board with quality infrastructure principles, except for this last point that I made. I'd like to illustrate some of the benefits through the case study of Delhi Power Privatization, PPP. Now, before PPP, the aggregate technical and commercial losses in Delhi were over 50%. This was quite unsustainable, both financially and physically. The losses of the predecessor organization, Delhi Vidyut Board, was over 1,200 crores, which was going up by 50 crores every year. That's the trend line number. Of course, there was poor service. So what the government of Delhi did was to do a two-stage bidding process, again related to infrastructure, sound infrastructure governance. Went in for competitive bidding. Ultimately, 2 bids were submitted. The bidding parameter was AT&C loss reduction for the first 5 years. Delhi was divided into 3 regions. One was gotten by the Tatas and 2 by the Reliance companies. So instead of giving all of these areas to a single company, it was a matter of priority that they did split the region, Delhi NCR region, and gave it to different organizations to facilitate what is called yardstick competition. The results are there is a dramatic reduction in AT&C losses in the 3 PPPs. The extreme left bar is the opening loss level, and you can see for Tatas on the extreme left, the number was 48%. On an average, Delhi was over 50%. BRPL, South Delhi, was 48%. BYPL, East Delhi, was 57%. And the NDMC area remained within public sector operations. So this was sort of a natural experiment that what can a PPP bring to the table as compared to purely public implementation. And if you see the results in terms of AT&C loss reduction, North Delhi, where Tatas are operating, they have gone down to 8 to 9% AT&C losses. What this does is to reduce the amount of tariff increases required for sustainable operations, and in that sense makes it politically feasible to implement these reforms. The 2 Reliance companies also are 11% and 13% right now in AT&C losses. But look at the public sector numbers. It has gone up since the point of privatization. So in that sense, this demonstrates advantage of PPP. And we are very upbeat on PPPs. I don't share the pessimism that the professor shared about PPPs. These are in terms of fiscal sustainability of the Delhi power reforms process, subsidies have come down. Subsidy as a percentage of the budget expenditure of Delhi government, we started from 8.6% at the point of privatization, went into less than 1% for many years. Lately, there has been an increase because of the policy change of the government of Delhi, in which they're subsidizing also households which are consuming between 200 to 400 units of electricity per month. But in terms of percentage of the budget expenditure, we are still close to 3 to 4%. The cumulative savings of the Delhi government from business as usual, at the point of privatization, the total demand of Delhi was about 2,000 megawatts. Right now, Because of this heat, we are touching about 6,500 megawatts. And the savings for the government of Delhi for the because of this privatization experience has been estimated at $4 billion. Again, we think that private participation has led to better accountability, better governance, technology upgradation leading to increased efficiency, and in tandem with the quality infrastructure investment principles talked about by the Japanese presidency. Now let me talk about the Indian infrastructure financing gap. We did some numbers in the Ministry of Finance. India is right now a 2.6 trillion economy. We want to be a 10 trillion economy by 2030. The numbers that we arrived at in terms of infrastructure investment is about $4.6 trillion. There was a growth report of the World Bank about 2008 in which Mr. Ahluwalia was a member. And that talked about that fast-growing countries of East Asia in their fast-growing phases has spent around 7 to 8% of their GDP on infrastructure. So taking that as the base and doing some internal numbers within the ministry, $200 billion on a per annum basis is the number we arrived at, and that corresponds to the 7 to 8% of the GDP number in the growth report. But this would have to increase to about 650 billion by 2030 on a per annum basis, but still would be only about 7% of the Indian GDP at that point of time. Currently, on an average from 2007 to 17, India has spent about $1.1 trillion. On an average, $110 billion on a per annum basis. There is an infrastructure financing gap of $90 billion on a per annum basis. Now, Indian infrastructure, there are three main sources of infrastructure finance. One is the gross budgetary support. Second is the internal and extra budgetary resources of the public sector. And third is private investment. The Indian story is mainly based on budgetary resources and bank lending. Gross budgetary support plus the internal and extra budgetary resources of the public sector for the last 15 years have been in the region of 4 to 5% of the GDP. We saw an upsurge in infrastructure investment in the 11th plan period, 2007 to 12, about 7.2% of GDP. Right now, in the 12th plan period, which ended in FY18, we are down to 5.6%. So that is the type of gap that we are facing. That is the $90 billion that I talked of. So there is a need to increase private participation in infrastructure. In the period 2007 to 17, about a third of the infrastructure investment came from the private sector. This needs to increase to about half in the years to come. We have, recently we have created a National Investment in Infrastructure Fund. The government is very happy about the performance of this fund in mobilizing resources for infrastructure. Public-private partnerships remain an important element of the Indian infrastructure story. As per the World Bank's private participation in infrastructure database, India ranks second among developing countries, both by the number of PPP projects and associated investment. Indian success in PPPs is built on three factors: the institutions that have been created, and there is this PPP appraisal committee seated in the Ministry of Finance. One recent example, the 6 airports that have been given out recently on PPP basis was processed through the PPPAC. There's a plan of giving out 400 railway stations on PPP basis. We are insisting that these rules be approved by PPPAC. There's some reluctance in the Railway Station Development Corporation, but we hope that we would manage that. Standardized contracts, very important element of the Indian infrastructure story, both in terms of processes, requests for qualification, requests for proposals, and in terms of substantive documents, the model concession agreements. One of the success stories, and we'll see how, is the second position that India has in terms of private participation in infrastructure is mainly because of the road projects. And there are 400 road projects basically based on a single document. So that standardization has been carried through. And that's one of the reasons for Indian success. We have a viability gap funding scheme too for economically viable projects which are not commercially viable. And so, this is the from the private participation in infrastructure database of the World Bank. In the period 1990 to 2018, about 980 PPP projects have come in India. Most prolific sector has been transport, the road sector. You can see about 500 projects in the transport sector, but mainly over 400 in the road sector itself. Energy, mainly in power generation as opposed to power distribution. But one significant omission is the water and sewerage sector, where there's immense need. There are success stories worldwide, like the Manila Water Company, but we have not been able to do it. The government is coming out with a liberalized viability gap funding scheme to spread PPPs in sectors which are underrepresented, including the water sector. We're trying to get this done in the next few months. Another big opportunity that we see is the brownfield asset monetization. We think that as the risk profile of projects changes over their life cycle, this needs to be tapped into. Brownfield, there was some talk of land acquisition issues in India. Brownfield projects are past that stage, and so they are considerably de-risked and hence amenable to institutional investment. Institutional investment from pension, insurance, and sovereign wealth funds also takes care of the asset liability mismatch, which is generally associated with bank financing of infrastructure. The NPA problem that we see in bank financing on the infrastructure side is mainly because of this asset liability mismatch. Brownfield asset monetization has been carried out in bits and pieces in India. The government wants to mainstream that policy. There are two specific structures that have been used, the infrastructure investment trusts and the toll operate transfer model. Now, the infrastructure investment trust regulations came out of SEBI in 2014. These source funds from long-term institutional investors to invest in infrastructure assets, and these investors have a claim on dedicated revenue streams generated by these assets. We have 3 operational InvITs in the country, and many more are in the pipeline. Toll operate transfer, $1.5 billion have been raised till now in the road sector. This needs to be mainstreamed too. And I just wanted to give the example of the first TOT bid that was carried out by the Ministry of Road Transport and Highways. It comprised 9 stretches of roads, 680 kilometers, raised 9,600 crores. And the reserve price of the government was 6,200 crores. The reserve price was calculated because these are brownfield assets. The toll revenue from these road stretches could be calculated for the concession period. The net present value of these toll revenues was given at the reserve price. And as you can see, there was a bump up of 50%. On an average, rupees 5 crore per kilometer. This is the efficiency gain that can come through private participation in infrastructure. We all know the big numbers. Globally, over $100 trillion of institutional investment is available, but less than 1% has gone into infrastructure, mainly because of the politics of infrastructure, large projects, underpriced. And so any talk of financial sustainability would make it very politically sensitive. But there are international experiences. We learned from Australia, New South Wales. They did electricity transmission assets of $26 billion in terms of brownfield asset monetization. This is not privatization, and I sharply wanted to differentiate between brownfield asset monetization and privatization that is related to divestment. DIPAM, what the DIPAM ministry does. Two essential differences. One, the money, instead of going into the Consolidated Fund of India, goes to the same agency which makes their assets available for brownfield asset monetization. And secondly, the operational control of these assets. The ownership remains with the public sector. The operational control of these assets is transferred temporarily for the concession period, and it comes back to the public authority after that concession period. So in these two crucial, because of these two crucial differences, the government feels that the political economy of privatization can be managed through brownfield asset monetization. Initial estimates carried out in the Ministry of Finance, we expect about 20% bump up in our yearly infrastructure investment by implementing this strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pratap. It was both very comprehensive as well as very rich in detail on the various policy initiatives underway in India to deal with this very massive problem. And you perhaps gave a little more emphasis on the positive side than on some of the problem side, but maybe for another occasion later. With that, may I request Mrs. Kuller to be the last panelist?
I would like to pick up on the third element which we have on this panel. We were to address financing quality infrastructure for inclusive growth. Quality infrastructure has been discussed in detail by Professor Nishizawa and comprehensively the financing aspect by Pratap. I would like to place for your consideration a few thoughts on financing quality infrastructure for inclusive growth. Now, inclusive growth is something which has been, I would say, relegated to the public sector, wrongly so. It is something which governments are supposed to do, and we elect them to do that, which is to make sure that all regions and all people living in various regions have equal access to public services, opportunities, as well as infrastructure. Now, in the entire discussion on infrastructure and quality infrastructure, the issues get a little muddled for the reason that we have concentrated on what Professor Nishizawa warned us very correctly, mind the infrastructure gap. That gap we started 70 years ago with a gap. We ended the 20th century with a slightly wider gap, and I'm presuming from the statistics which Pratap has placed before us that this gap is only going to widen. And as the infrastructure gap widens, the financing gap naturally cannot keep pace. So my submission here would be for your consideration that you need growth so that it provides fiscal space for governments to use those resources for providing public goods, merit goods, and services. Now, while doing that, there has been, in India at least, and across the world, an emphasis on making sure that the provisioning gets spread across various sectors, but there has been no attention to either access or quality. That focus is currently coming back, And with the SDGs as the touchstone for inclusiveness, I would suggest that the SDG, which talks of governance, strong institutions, and partnerships, is what cuts across the provisioning of quality infrastructure and the financing part of it. In these partnerships, we are looking at from the local to the global and the divergences that exist across communities to regions to countries. While we do talk about the inclusiveness in terms of those who are left out, which is either vulnerable groups or people or women or children or the aged, as Professor said, we have not paid enough attention to making provisioning accessible in the sense of affordable. The sectors that we have been talking about, as we did in India in the initial years of development, are the big sectors. We talk of big sectors, big projects, big financing. What we have not looked at is where are the opportunities in sectors which need it most today across the G20 as well as in India. For your consideration, I would suggest that these are first and foremost livable, breathable cities and towns where you have a reasonable access to health, education, water supply, sanitation, and of course electricity. Now here, when we used to talk of these sectors earlier, we have somehow moved away from the intricacies of providing for access, which is making sure that they are now in our current setup, the gaps in these sectors are going to be bottlenecks for growth. The gaps which need to be filled on an urgent basis across these. The sectors that I'm really pointing towards are the urban sectors, and in terms of governments, the various levels of governments that we have that actually provide for these sectors. The urban sector, of course, comes to mind the first, and water and waste as the prime candidates for a detailed examination of where the infrastructure needs and gaps can be filled in these sectors. The other low-hanging fruit, of course, is urban transportation, where the existing models, the existing financing may find ready candidates as well as ready takers. In addition, we have going forward renewables, we have distributed generation, and most critical of all, affordable housing. Affordable housing with urban transportation and transport-oriented development provides for, even in India, the largest growing segment as on date. So I would suggest that these are the sectors that we need to look at. We need to look at the upstream investments before we look at projects and projectize them. We need to look at the governance across the 3 tiers, at least in India. Many other countries in the G20 have done much better in ensuring that the lower tiers of governments actually provide for it and raise the resources for such services, public services. We in India, on the other hand, at best stop at state governments. We need to look at local governments at the village level as well as the urban body level. Strengthen the governance systems there, invest in them. Otherwise, there's no point in talking about providing infrastructure access or providing roads. The second area where large investments need to come before we look at projects is in technologies across these sectors, which makes them environmentally sound and socially desirable to have in the longer term cycle of the next at least 30 to 50 years. Many of these are evolving technologies and many of them require huge inputs at the upper ends rather than at the project level. Much of these are also locally driven in the sense that the innovations in these sectors, which will reduce costs and increase their resilience to both environment as well as social pressures, are very local.